The dust kicked up in swirling clouds as the stagecoach rolled to a stop outside Finnegan's Mercantile in Bannack, Montana Territory, 1866. Fiona Taylor clutched her swollen belly with one hand while the other gripped the worn leather seat beneath her. 6 months pregnant and utterly alone in the frontier town, she had come west seeking refuge after her husband's death in the waning days of the Civil War. The journey had taken everything from her, nearly all her money, her strength, and very nearly her hope. "Last stop, madam," the driver called, his voice rough from years of shouting over thundering hoofbeats. Fiona nodded weakly, her chestnut hair falling from its pins as she struggled to collect herself. The summer heat pressed down like a physical weight, and the endless jostling of the coach had left her light-headed. She needed supplies before seeking out the widow who had advertised a room for rent on the edge of town. Inside the Mercantile, Xavier Quinn stood at the counter, his hat in his hands as he negotiated with old man Finnegan over the price of barbed wire. At 32, Xavier had spent the last decade building the Double Circle Ranch from nothing into something worth fighting for. The war had taken his brother, leaving him to run the operation alone, but he'd managed to make something of himself despite the odds. 15 cents a pound is highway robbery, Finnegan, Xavier said, his voice low but firm. I need 50 pounds, not 5. The shopkeeper's retort died on his lips as the bell above the door tinkled. Xavier turned, catching sight of the young woman who entered. Her dress, though travel-worn, was of good quality, and despite her obvious fatigue, she carried herself with dignity. What caught his attention, however, was the pronounced swell of her abdomen and the pallor of her face. Fiona made it 3 steps into the Mercantile before the room began to spin. The heat, exhaustion, and hunger formed a dangerous combination. She reached for the nearest shelf to steady herself, but her fingers found only air. "Madam," Xavier called, already moving toward her as her knees buckled. He crossed the distance in 3 long strides, catching her just before she hit the floor. One strong arm slipped behind her back while the other cradled her head. For a moment, their eyes met hers wide with fear and embarrassment, his filled with concern. "Water, Finnegan," Xavier barked over his shoulder. "And something sweet if you have it." "I'm so sorry," Fiona whispered, attempting to right herself but finding no strength to do so. "I don't know what came over me." "Don't apologize," Xavier replied, helping her to a chair that Mrs. Finnegan had hurriedly brought forward. "When was the last time you ate, madam?" Fiona hesitated. "Yesterday morning, I believe. The stage doesn't stop long enough for proper meals." Xavier's jaw tightened. He'd seen too many travelers pushed to their limits by the unforgiving journey west. "Mr. Finnegan, bring some of that ham and bread too." The old shopkeeper nodded, hurrying to fetch the requested items while his wife fanned Fiona with a folded newspaper. "I can't accept charity," Fiona protested weakly as Xavier knelt beside her chair. "I have some money." "This isn't charity," he replied, his voice gentler than most in town had ever heard it. "This is basic human decency. I'm Xavier Quinn. I own the Double Circle Ranch just outside town." "Fiona Taylor," she responded, accepting the glass of water Mrs. Finnegan offered. "I've just arrived from Philadelphia." Xavier's eyebrows rose. "Philadelphia to Bannack is one hell of a journey, Mrs. Taylor, especially in your condition." The flush that colored her cheeks told him he'd overstepped. "I apologize for my bluntness," he added quickly. "Life out here tends to strip away formalities." Fiona sipped the water, feeling strength returning gradually. "No need to apologize, Mr. Quinn. And you're right, it was a difficult journey, one I had little choice but to undertake." There was something in her voice, a mixture of determination and resignation that struck Xavier deeply. Before he could respond, Mr. Finnegan returned with a plate of food, which he set on a small table beside Fiona. "On the house," the shopkeeper insisted when she reached for her reticule. "We take care of our own in Bannack." "But I'm not one of your own," Fiona said softly. Xavier stood, settling his hat back on his head. "You are now Mrs. Taylor. Eat something, then perhaps I can help you get settled. Are you meeting someone in town?" Fiona shook her head, taking a small bite of bread. "No, I've arranged to rent a room from a Mrs. Hollister. She advertised in the Eastern papers." Xavier and the Finnegans exchanged glances. "Ruth Hollister passed on 3 months ago, madam," Mrs. Finnegan said gently. "Her son sold the house and moved to Helena." The news hit Fiona like a physical blow. The room she had counted on, the only beacon of certainty in her uncertain future, was gone. She set down the bread, her appetite fleeing. "I see," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Then I'll need to inquire about other accommodations." "There's the boarding house," Mr. Finnegan offered. "Though Jenkins doesn't usually take women in your condition. Says they're too much trouble." Xavier watched as Fiona straightened her spine, pride overtaking exhaustion. In that moment, he made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. "Mrs. Taylor can stay at my ranch," he said. "I have a cabin that my foreman used before he got married. It's simple but clean, and you'd have privacy." 3 pairs of eyes turned to him in surprise, none more shocked than Fiona's. "Mr. Quinn, that's very generous, but I couldn't possibly—" "It's sitting empty," Xavier interrupted. "And I've got a housekeeper who comes in 3 times a week. Mexican lady named Teresa. She'd be glad of the female company, I imagine." Fiona hesitated, weighing her limited options. A room in a stranger's home versus potential homelessness in a frontier town. "I can pay rent," she insisted, "and I can work. I'm quite capable despite." She gestured vaguely at her belly. Xavier nodded. "We can discuss terms later. For now, finish eating while I gather your things from the stage. Then we'll head to the ranch before the afternoon heat gets worse." As Xavier stepped outside to retrieve her trunk, Fiona found herself bombarded with questions from Mrs. Finnegan. "Are you widowed, dear?" the older woman asked. Not unkindly, Fiona nodded. "My husband died at Petersburg just before the surrender. I stayed in Philadelphia as long as I could, but my in-laws made it clear that without their son, I and especially the child were unwelcome." Mrs. Finnegan clicked her tongue sympathetically. "Some people forget their Christianity when it's most needed." She leaned closer. "Xavier Quinn is a good man. Keeps to himself mostly, but fair and honest. You could do worse for a landlord in these parts." Fiona managed a small smile. "I'm grateful for his kindness, but it will be a temporary arrangement. Once the baby comes and I'm on my feet, I intend to establish myself independently." The older woman patted her hand. "Of course, dear, but the West has a way of changing plans. Now, what supplies were you needing today?" By the time Xavier returned, Fiona had finished eating and compiled a modest list of necessities. He carried her trunk with apparent ease, setting it by the door. "I'll load this in the wagon," he said. "Take your time with your purchases." As he stepped back outside, Fiona couldn't help but observe him through the window. Tall and broad-shouldered, Xavier Quinn moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. His face was weathered from years under the Montana sun, but his blue eyes held a kindness that belied his rugged appearance. She estimated him to be in his early 30s, though frontier life aged a person differently than city living. "He's never married," Mrs. Finnegan said, following Fiona's gaze. "Came here with his brother right after the war started, built that ranch from nothing but grit and determination." "His brother?" Fiona asked, selecting a few basic toiletries from the shelf. "Killed at Antietam." Union sighed. Xavier stayed behind to run the ranch exemption for food production. Mrs. Finnegan wrapped Fiona's purchases in brown paper. Lost his parents young, from what I understand. It's just him now. Fiona absorbed this information silently. She was no stranger to loss, but there was something particularly poignant about a man building a life alone in this vast, unforgiving territory. After paying for her supplies, wincing inwardly at how quickly her limited funds were dwindling, Fiona stepped outside to find Xavier waiting beside a sturdy wagon. He offered his hand to help her up to the seat, his grip firm but gentle. "It's about 5 miles to the ranch," he explained as he climbed up beside her. "Not far, but the road gets rough in places." Fiona nodded, clutching her reticule in her lap. "Mr. Quinn, I want to thank you again for your generosity. I promise I won't be an imposition for long." Xavier clicked to the horses, setting them in motion before responding. "Mrs. Taylor, out here people help each other because tomorrow it might be them needing assistance." He glanced at her sidelong. "May I ask what brings you all the way to Bannack?" It's not exactly a destination people choose without reason. Fiona watched the town recede behind them, considering how much to share with this stranger who had so unexpectedly become her benefactor. "After my husband died, I discovered he had invested in a gold claim here. The paperwork suggested it might be valuable, but I've no way of knowing if it's genuine. It was my only option for a fresh start." Xavier's expression remained neutral, but his knuckles whitened slightly on the reins. "Gold claims in these parts are tricky business, Mrs. Taylor. Many have been swindled by unscrupulous sellers. Do you have the documentation with you?" "In my trunk," she confirmed. "It's a claim registered to Benjamin Taylor in Grasshopper Creek. I've brought all the legal papers proving my right as his widow to claim ownership." Xavier nodded slowly. "I know the area well. Once you're settled, I can help you look into it, though I should warn you most of the easy gold was taken years ago during the first rush." "I understand the chances are slim," Fiona replied, "but slim chances are all I have left." They fell into silence as the wagon climbed away from town, following a winding road that hugged the base of rolling hills. Stands of ponderosa pine provided occasional shade, their scent mingling with sage and dust in the warm air. Fiona found herself studying the landscape with a mixture of apprehension and wonder. So different from Philadelphia's crowded streets and brick buildings, Montana territory stretched out vast and wild, indifferent to the tiny human lives that sought to carve existence from its bounty. The sky seemed impossibly huge, a dome of brilliant blue unmarred by smoke or tall structures. "It's overwhelming at first," Xavier said, reading her expression, "but there's a beauty to it that gets under your skin." "It's magnificent," Fiona admitted, "and terrifying." Xavier's mouth curved slightly. "That's a fair assessment. Winter's the worst and the best. Everything goes quiet under the snow. You can hear your own heartbeat sometimes." The wagon crested a small rise, and suddenly the Double Circle Ranch came into view. A substantial log house anchored the property, with a large barn and several outbuildings arranged in a rough semicircle. Corrals held horses, and in the distance, cattle dotted the grassland. A creek wound through the property, lined with cottonwoods whose leaves flashed silver in the breeze. "It's lovely," Fiona said, genuine admiration in her voice. Xavier's expression softened with pride. "It's taken 10 years to build it to this point. My brother and I started with 20 acres and 6 cows. Now we've got 500 acres and 300 head. "We?" Fiona asked gently. Xavier's jaw tightened briefly. "Old habits. It was just me after 62. He guided the wagon toward a small cabin set apart from the main house, near the creek. As they approached, Fiona could see it was simple but well-maintained, with a small covered porch and neat curtains in the windows. "This is my foreman's old place," Xavier explained, bringing the wagon to a stop. "Tom got married last year and built a house for his bride closer to town. I've kept this up, though." He jumped down and came around to help Fiona descend. As she took his hand, the baby chose that moment to deliver a sharp kick, causing her to gasp slightly. Xavier's eyes widened in alarm. "Are you all right?" Fiona laughed softly. "Yes, just a very active passenger. He or she has been restless since we left Philadelphia." A flicker of something wonder perhaps crossed Xavier's face before he schooled his expression. "Let's get you inside. You must be exhausted." The cabin was indeed simple, but clean and well-appointed. A main room served as kitchen and living area with a small bedroom off to one side. A cast-iron stove anchored one wall and sturdy handmade furniture filled the space without crowding it. "The pump is on the porch for water," Xavier explained, setting her trunk down. "Outhouse is around back. I keep firewood stacked on the side. Teresa comes Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays to clean the main house. I'll ask her to look in on you as well." Fiona stood in the center of the room, suddenly overwhelmed by the day's events. That morning, she had been a desperate woman with dwindling resources and uncertain prospects. Now she had shelter, through the kindness of a stranger whose motives she couldn't fully discern. "Mr. Quinn," she began hesitantly, "you've been extraordinarily kind, but I must insist on formal arrangements. What rent do you expect for the cabin?" Xavier regarded her for a long moment, recognizing the pride that kept her spine straight despite her obvious fatigue. $3 a month would be fair," he said finally, "and perhaps you might help Teresa with mending when she comes. She's getting older, and her eyes aren't what they used to be." It was less than half what Fiona had expected to pay Mrs. Hollister, but she recognized it as a fair compromise between charity and independence. "That's acceptable, thank you," Xavier nodded, turning toward the door. "I'll bring your things in, then leave you to rest. I imagine that stagecoach journey wasn't kind to you." As he retrieved her modest belongings from the wagon, Fiona moved to the small window that overlooked the creek. The water sparkled in the afternoon sun, and a gentle breeze stirred the cottonwood leaves. Despite everything, the uncertainty, the fear, the grief that still clung to her, she felt a small seed of hope take root. Perhaps Montana territory wasn't just a desperate gamble after all. Perhaps it could become home. Xavier returned with the last of her bags, setting them carefully by the trunk. "There's food in the cupboard, simple stuff, but it should tide you over until tomorrow. I'll come by in the morning to show you around the property." "You're very kind, Mr. Quinn," Fiona said, turning from the window. "Xavier," he corrected gently. "Out here, formality doesn't last long." "Then you must call me Fiona," she replied, offering a small smile. Something flickered in his eyes, a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Rest well, Fiona. Welcome to the double circle." After he left, Fiona sank onto the small bed, relief washing over her in waves. For the first time in months, she didn't have to be constantly vigilant, constantly planning her next move. The cabin was secure, the territory around her vast, but somehow comforting in its wildness. She placed a hand on her swollen belly, feeling the child within shift and settle. "We're going to be all right," she whispered, both promise and prayer. "Somehow we're going to make this work." Outside, Xavier paused by the wagon, looking back at the cabin. He couldn't explain the impulse that had driven him to offer shelter to a stranger, a pregnant widow with uncertain prospects. Perhaps it was the quiet dignity in her eyes, or the way she had fainted so gracefully, fighting to maintain composure even as her body betrayed her. Whatever the reason, Xavier Quinn, who had spent a decade keeping people at arm's length, found himself inexplicably drawn to Fiona Taylor. And as he climbed into the wagon and headed toward the main house, he wondered if perhaps his solitary existence was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the promise of heat later in the day. Fiona awoke, feeling more rested than she had in months, the simple bed a luxury after weeks on stage coaches and in rough wayside inns. She dressed carefully in one of her better dresses, navy blue cotton that still accommodated her growing form, and pinned her hair in a simple but neat style. A knock at the door came just as she finished a breakfast of bread and preserves she'd found in the cupboard. Xavier stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking freshly shaved and somewhat hesitant. "Good morning," he greeted her. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," Fiona admitted, stepping back to invite him in. "Would you like coffee? I found some in the cupboard." "Already had mine, but thank you." Xavier remained in the doorway, seemingly reluctant to enter her space. "I thought I might show you around the property this morning if you're feeling up to it." Fiona nodded, reaching for her shawl. "I'd like that very much. I need to get my bearings if I'm to be staying here for a time." They walked slowly, Xavier shortening his stride to match her pace. The morning air was still cool, carrying the scent of pine and grass. He pointed out the various buildings: the barn, the bunkhouse where 3 ranch hands lived, the smokehouse, and the corral where several horses watched them curiously. "The men are out with the herd today," Xavier explained. "Tom Wilson, my foreman, and the others are moving cattle to summer pasture up in the hills." "It's quite an operation for one man to manage," Fiona observed. Xavier's mouth quirked slightly. "Most days I don't think about it that way. It's just what needs doing." He paused, gazing out over the property. "My brother and I had big dreams when we bought this land. Sometimes I wonder what he'd think of what it's become." "I'm sure he'd be proud," Fiona said softly. "To build something so substantial from nothing, that's a remarkable achievement." Xavier glanced at her, appreciation warming his eyes. "Thank you." After a moment he added, "Would you like to see the main house? Teresa should be arriving soon. I'd like to introduce you." The main house was larger than Fiona had expected, 2 stories of sturdy logs with a wide porch wrapping around 2 sides. Inside, it was simply but comfortably furnished, with a large kitchen, a dining room, and a sitting area dominated by a massive stone fireplace. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that spoke of varied interests from animal husbandry to Greek philosophy. "You're a reader," Fiona noted with surprise and pleasure. Xavier rubbed the back of his neck, almost embarrassed. "Winter nights are long out here. Books help pass the time." Before Fiona could respond, the front door opened, and a stout, gray-haired Mexican woman entered, arms laden with basket of fresh vegetables. "Buenos dias, Xavier Quinn," she called, before stopping short at the sight of Fiona. Her dark eyes widened, darting between Xavier and his guest with obvious curiosity. "Teresa, this is Mrs. Fiona Taylor," Xavier said. "She'll be staying in Tom's old cabin for a while. Mrs. Taylor, this is Teresa Hernandez. She keeps this place and me from falling into complete disorder." Teresa set down her basket and wiped her hands on her apron before extending one to Fiona. "Welcome, Senora. It is good to have another woman here. These men, they live like bears sometimes." Fiona laughed, taking Teresa's weathered hand in hers. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Hernandez." "Teresa, poor favor, we are not so formal here." Her gaze dropped to Fiona's belly and her expression softened. "When is the bébé due?" "October, the doctor thought," Fiona replied, self-consciously placing a hand on her stomach. Teresa nodded approvingly. "Good timing. Before the worst winter." "I have 5 children myself, all grown now. If you need anything, you ask me." "Thank you," Fiona said, genuinely touched by the woman's immediate acceptance. "I'd welcome any guidance. This is all very new to me." Xavier watched the exchange with an odd expression, part relief, part something indefinable. "Teresa, Mrs. Taylor will need some help getting settled. Could you show her where things are stored in case she needs anything when you're not here? She, of course." Teresa turned to Fiona with a warm smile. "Come, I will show you my kitchen and we can talk while Xavier Quinn attends to his business." Xavier nodded. "I need to check the north pasture fence. I'll be back by midday." He hesitated, then added, "If you'd like, Mrs. Taylor, you're welcome to take your meals here at the main house. It would be no trouble." Before Fiona could protest about imposing, Teresa interjected, "It is settled. I cook too much for just one man anyway. You will eat with us." And just like that, Fiona found herself incorporated into the rhythm of the Double Circle Ranch. Over the next 2 weeks, she gradually adjusted to life in Montana territory. The endless sky no longer seemed so intimidating, and she began to appreciate the stark beauty of the landscape. Teresa proved to be a godsend, practical, warm, and full of wisdom about everything from childbirth to frontier survival. Xavier, for his part, maintained a respectful distance while ensuring Fiona had everything she needed. He joined her for meals when his work allowed, their conversations gradually deepening beyond pleasantries. She learned about his childhood in Ohio, his journey west with his brother, and the difficult years building the ranch through drought, harsh winters, and Indian conflicts. In turn, she shared stories of her life in Philadelphia, her marriage to Benjamin a brief but happy union, and her dreams of creating a stable home for her child. What she didn't share was the full extent of her in-laws' cruelty after Benjamin's death. How they had blamed her for his enlistment, accused her of entrapping him with pregnancy, and finally given her an impossible choice: surrender the child to them upon birth, or leave with nothing but what she could carry, and the worthless gold claim her husband had purchased on a whim. One evening, 2 weeks after her arrival, Fiona sat on the small porch of her cabin, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and pink. The air was cooling rapidly, as it tended to do in the high country, and she had wrapped a shawl around her shoulders against the chill. The sound of approaching footsteps drew her attention. Xavier walked toward her cabin, carrying what appeared to be a bundle of papers. He'd removed his hat, and the evening breeze ruffled his dark hair, streaked with early gray at the temples. "May I join you?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. "Of course," Fiona replied, suddenly conscious of her loosened hair and simple house dress. "Is everything all right?" Xavier sat, placing the papers on his lap. "I went into town today. Spoke with Judge Hawkins about your husband's gold claim." Fiona straightened, hope and trepidation warring within her. "And the claim itself is legitimate," Xavier said carefully. "Benjamin Taylor did purchase a proper claim on Grasshopper Creek in '63. The problem is—" He hesitated, clearly reluctant to continue. "Please, Xavier. Whatever it is, I need to know." He met her eyes directly. "The claim has been worked out. There's nothing left of value there. Judge Hawkins knew of it specifically because there was some trouble with it last year. A group of miners tried to jump it, thinking it had been abandoned. When they found it worthless, they moved on." The news shouldn't have been surprising. Fiona had known the claim was a long shot, but the confirmation of its worthlessness still struck her like a physical blow. Her last connection to Benjamin, her justification for the arduous journey west, her hope for independence all evaporated in an instant. "I see," she said finally, her voice remarkably steady despite the turmoil within. "Well, that certainly clarifies my situation." Xavier watched her face carefully. "There's something else. The claim includes 10 acres of land along the creek. It's not much, but it's yours legally. Judge Hawkins confirmed your right to it as Benjamin's widow. Fiona blinked in surprise. Land. Benjamin never mentioned land, only the gold rights. A full claim includes surface rights, Xavier explained. Most miners didn't care about that part. They were after what was beneath the ground, but the land itself is yours. What good is 10 acres of worthless mining land? Fiona asked, bitterness creeping into her voice for the first time since he'd known her. It borders the double circle's northern boundary, Xavier said quietly. It's not suitable for mining anymore, but it's good grazing land. It has water access and some timber. It's not worthless, Fiona. She stared at him, processing this information. Are you saying you want to buy it from me? Xavier shook his head. I'm saying you have options. You could sell it to me or someone else. You could hold on to it as an investment, or you could use it. Use it how? Fiona asked, confusion evident in her voice. Build on it. Start a small homestead. Raise chickens, keep a garden. 10 acres isn't enough for a proper ranch, but it's enough for a home. Xavier leaned forward, an intensity in his expression she hadn't seen before. You came west for a fresh start. Maybe this is it, just not in the way you expected. Fiona laughed incredulously. Xavier, I'm a Philadelphia socialite's daughter who married a banker's son. I know nothing about homesteading or raising livestock, and in case you haven't noticed, I'm 6 months pregnant and alone. You're not alone, Xavier said, the words escaping before he could consider them. You have Teresa. And he hesitated, then continued more carefully, you have me as a neighbor at least. Something shifted in the air between them, an acknowledgement of the connection that had been growing, tentative and undefined over the past 2 weeks. Fiona looked away, focusing on the darkening landscape. I appreciate that more than I can express, but reality remains. I have no income, no husband, and soon a child to support. 10 acres of land doesn't change that fundamental problem. Xavier was silent for a long moment. What if you could earn an income right here? She turned back to him, eyebrows raised in question. The ranch books are in disarray, he admitted. I can run cattle, fix fences, and negotiate contracts, but I'm months behind on correspondence and accounting. Tom's wife used to help, but since they moved to town. He shrugged. I noticed the books on your shelf. Dickens, Shakespeare, history. You're educated, Fiona. Could you help bring order to my business affairs? The offer hung between them, practical yet intimate in its implications. Working closely together would inevitably deepen whatever was developing between them. You would pay me? Fiona asked carefully. As you would any employee, Xavier nodded. Fair wages for necessary work. The ranch can afford it. He hesitated, then added, and it would give you time to consider your options regarding the land. Fiona considered the proposal, turning it over in her mind. The chance to earn her own money was appealing, necessary, even, and she did have the skills Xavier needed. Her father had insisted she learn bookkeeping alongside her brothers, believing it essential for managing a household properly. When would you want me to start? She asked finally. Relief washed over Xavier's face. Whenever you feel ready. The ledgers aren't going anywhere. Tomorrow, then, Fiona decided. I can come to the main house after breakfast. Xavier stood, handing her the papers he'd brought, legal documents confirming her ownership of the claim and land. I should let you rest. Good night, Fiona. As he turned to leave, she called after him, Xavier. When he looked back, she continued, Thank you, not just for this, but for everything since I arrived. Your kindness has been unexpected. Something flickered in his eyes, vulnerability. Perhaps before he nodded once and continued toward the main house, his figure gradually disappearing into the gathering darkness. Fiona remained on the porch long after he'd gone, contemplating the strange turns her life had taken. She had come west seeking gold and independence, only to find barren land and dependency on a stranger's generosity. Yet somehow, sitting on this small porch in the Montana wilderness, watching stars emerge in the vast sky, she felt more at peace than she had since before Benjamin left for war. Perhaps, she thought, placing a hand on her belly as the baby stirred within, there were different kinds of riches to be found in this wild territory. The following weeks established a new rhythm to life at the double circle. Each morning, Fiona would walk from her cabin to the main house, where Xavier had set up a small desk for her in the corner of his study. There she would spend the morning organizing his chaotic business records, writing correspondence to cattle buyers, and meticulously updating the ranch's ledgers. Xavier often worked nearby, going over maps of the property or writing in his own journal. Their initial awkwardness gradually gave way to a comfortable working relationship, punctuated by breaks when Teresa would bring coffee and insist they both rest their eyes. In the afternoons, when the summer heat made indoor work stifling, Fiona would return to her cabin for a nap, a concession to her advancing pregnancy. Later, she often sat on her porch mending or reading, sometimes walking to the creek to soak her swollen feet in the cool water. It was during one such afternoon, as July gave way to August, that Xavier found her sitting on a fallen log by the creek, her bare feet dangling in the water and her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked so at peace with the landscape that he hesitated to disturb her, but she sensed his presence and turned. "I hope I'm not trespassing," she said with a small smile. "The water feels wonderful on hot days." "It's your creek as much as anyone's," Xavier replied, approaching slowly. "I used to swim here as a younger man. Less dignity to maintain then." Fiona laughed, the sound carrying across the water. "Dignity is overrated. In Philadelphia, it would be scandalous for me to sit like this. Here, no one sees but the birds and fish." She tilted her face to the sun. "I never imagined I could love such an untamed place, but there's something about the openness that feels like freedom." Xavier sat on the log beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "That's what drew my brother and me west. In Ohio, everything felt prescribed: who we were supposed to be, how we were supposed to live. Out here, a man can define himself by his actions, not his family name or inheritance." "And a woman?" Fiona asked, glancing at him sideways. Xavier considered this. "I'd like to say it's the same, but that wouldn't be truthful. It's harder for women, especially alone, but the ones who succeed out here are formidable. Like Teresa, she crossed the border alone after her husband died, raised 5 children while working for other people, sent all of them to school." He looked at Fiona directly. "Or like you, traveling across the country at 6 months along, determined to make a life for yourself and your child." Fiona's cheeks colored at the compliment. "I had little choice. Sometimes desperation masquerades as courage." "I disagree," Xavier said quietly. "Plenty of desperate people do nothing, paralyzed by fear. You acted. That's courage, regardless of what drove it." They sat in companionable silence for a time, listening to the creek's gentle burbling and the distant lowing of cattle. Fiona's feet made small ripples in the water, disturbing a pattern of sunlight dappling the surface. "Xavier," she said finally, "may I ask you something personal?" He tensed slightly but nodded. "Of course. Why have you never married?" "Teresa mentioned that many local families have tried to match their daughters with you." The question caught him off guard. He stared at the water, gathering his thoughts. "After James, my brother, died, everything changed. I threw myself into building the ranch, partly to honor his memory, partly to avoid thinking about what I'd lost." He paused. "And I suppose I developed a habit of keeping people at arm's length, safer that way." Safer from what? Fiona pressed gently. From loss, Xavier admitted, the words feeling strange on his tongue. If you don't let people close, you don't feel it when they're gone. Fiona nodded slowly. I understand that impulse. After Benjamin died, I wanted to lock myself away from everyone. But then I discovered I was carrying his child, and suddenly isolation wasn't an option anymore. She placed a hand on her belly, which had grown considerably in the weeks since her arrival. This little one forced me back into the world, even when the world seemed unbearably cruel. Your in-laws, Xavier said, remembering fragments she'd shared about her departure from Philadelphia. They didn't support you. A shadow crossed Fiona's face. They blamed me for Benjamin's enlistment, said I should have prevented him from going as if I had that power. She sighed. When they learned of the pregnancy, they offered to take the child and provide for it, on the condition that I remove myself from its life entirely. Xavier's expression hardened. That's monstrous. They thought they were being generous, Fiona said with a bitter smile. When I refused, they gave me Benjamin's personal effects, including the deed to the mining claim, and asked me to leave their home. I had some savings and my jewelry to sell, enough to get me west, I thought. She shook her head. Well, it doesn't matter what I thought. Here I am. Here you are, Xavier echoed softly. For what it's worth, I think you made the right choice. No child should be separated from a mother who wants them. Fiona looked at him with gratitude shining in her eyes. Thank you for saying that. Sometimes I doubt myself, wonder if I was selfish to deny my child the advantages they could have provided. Material advantages don't make up for a loveless home, Xavier said firmly. My parents had little, but they gave us security and affection. That's worth more than fine clothes or prestigious schools. Fiona studied his face, seeing beyond the weathered exterior to the principled man beneath. In that moment, something shifted between them, a deepening of understanding, a recognition of shared values despite their different backgrounds. I should get back, she said finally, withdrawing her feet from the water. I promised Teresa I'd help with preserving the blackberries she picked this morning. Xavier stood, offering his hand to help her up. The touch lingered a moment longer than necessary, both of them aware of the current of attraction that had been building steadily over the weeks. Xavier, Fiona said hesitantly, still holding his hand. I've been thinking about the land, my 10 acres. I'd like to see it. Would you take me there sometime? Of course, he replied. Tomorrow, if you'd like. It's not far, just over that ridge to the north. Fiona nodded, releasing his hand reluctantly. Tomorrow, then. As they walked back toward the ranch buildings, Xavier found himself hyper-aware of her presence beside him, the gentle sway of her walk adapted to her changing body. The way the sunlight caught auburn highlights in her chestnut hair, the quiet determination in her profile. For the first time in years, the protective wall he'd built around himself felt less like security and more like an unnecessary barrier. That night, lying in his bed in the quiet ranch house, Xavier acknowledged what he had been avoiding for weeks. He was falling in love with Fiona Taylor. The realization should have terrified him, sent him retreating back into the solitary existence he had carefully constructed. Instead, he felt a strange sense of inevitability, as if his heart had made the decision long before his mind caught up. The question that kept him awake into the early hours was whether Fiona could possibly feel the same way about him, a rough rancher with little to offer beyond hard work and a piece of Montana earth. And even if she did, would she stay once her child was born and she had more options? Morning brought no certainty, only the knowledge that he would keep his promise to show her the land that was rightfully hers. After breakfast, Xavier saddled 2 horses, his own sturdy gelding, and a gentle mare he kept for visitors. Fiona emerged from her cabin wearing a simple dress modified to accommodate her growing belly, her hair braided and pinned securely. She eyed the horses with apprehension. "I haven't ridden since I was a girl," she admitted, "and never in my current condition." Xavier immediately reconsidered his plan. "We can take the wagon instead. It will be slower but safer." Fiona shook her head. "No, I need to learn to ride if I'm to live out here. Just help me." The trust implicit in her request touched him deeply. "Of course. Daisy here is the gentlest horse on the ranch. She'll take good care of you." With careful instruction and steady hands to assist her, Fiona mounted the mare, adjusting her position to accommodate her pregnancy. Xavier shortened the stirrups to a comfortable length and handed her the reins. "We'll go slowly," he promised. "If you feel uncomfortable at any point, tell me immediately." The journey to Fiona's land took nearly an hour at their leisurely pace. Xavier led them along the creek, following a path that avoided steep inclines or rough terrain. Fiona quickly adapted to the horse's rhythm, her natural grace compensating for her inexperience. By the time they crested the final ridge, she was smiling with the simple joy of movement and discovery. "It's just ahead," Xavier said, pointing to a bend in the creek where a small meadow opened up, bordered by pine trees on one side and rocky outcroppings on the other. "That's your land, from the creek up to those rocks, and extending about a quarter-mile in both directions." They dismounted at the edge of the meadow, tethering the horses to a young aspen. Fiona stood silent, taking in her property with wide eyes. Wildflowers dotted the grass in patches of purple and yellow, and the creek widened into a small pool before continuing its journey downhill. The remnants of mining activity were visible piles of discarded rock and the collapsed entrance to a shallow shaft, but nature had already begun reclaiming the disturbed earth. "It's beautiful," Fiona whispered, emotion catching in her throat. "I never imagined." "The previous owner, your husband, never developed it beyond the mining operation," Xavier explained, walking beside her into the meadow. "But there's good soil here. See these wildflowers. Anything would grow in this spot. And there's enough timber on the north edge for building." Fiona moved slowly through the grass, one hand trailing over the tops of tall stems, the other resting on her belly. "Where would you put a house if it were yours?" she asked suddenly. Xavier considered the question seriously. "There," he said, pointing to a slight rise near the tree line. "Good drainage when the spring rains come, protected from the worst winter winds by those pines, but with a clear view of the approach, close enough to water without risking flood." Fiona walked to the spot he indicated, turning in a slow circle to take in the view. From here, she could see the double-circle buildings in the distance, smoke rising from the main house chimney despite the summer heat. In the other direction, mountains rose blue and distant against the horizon. "Yes," she said quietly, "this would be the place." Xavier watched her, standing amid the wildflowers with the vast Montana sky above her, and felt something fundamental shift within him. This woman, who had arrived in his life so unexpectedly, had somehow become essential to his vision of the future. "Fiona," he began, then hesitated, uncertain how to express the tumult of emotions she evoked in him. She turned to him, a question in her eyes. "Yes." Before he could continue, a sharp crack echoed across the meadow, a gunshot followed by another. Both of them froze, instinctively crouching lower in the grass. "What was that?" Fiona whispered, fear evident in her voice. Xavier's expression hardened. "Trouble. Stay here." He moved quickly back toward the horses, retrieving a rifle from his saddle holster. "I'm not staying alone," Fiona insisted, following him despite his protest. "Where are the shots coming from?" Xavier listened intently, then pointed toward the property line where her land met the double circle. "That direction. Could be rustlers or just hunters who have strayed onto private land. Another shot rang out, closer this time, accompanied by the sound of men shouting. Xavier's jaw tightened as he recognized the voice of his foreman, Tom Wilson. "That's Tom," he said grimly. "Something's wrong. Get on Daisy, we need to head back to the ranch." "But now, Fiona," Xavier cut her off, his tone brooking no argument. "If there's trouble, I need to know you're safe." Recognizing the urgency in his voice, Fiona allowed him to help her back onto the mare. Once she was securely mounted, Xavier swung onto his own horse, rifle at the ready. "Stay close behind me," he instructed. "If I tell you to ride for the house, do it without hesitation." They made their way cautiously back toward the ranch, avoiding the open ground in favor of the tree line. As they neared the property boundary, the commotion grew louder, men shouting, horses whinnying in distress, and the occasional crack of a pistol. Xavier held up his hand, signaling Fiona to stop. "Wait here," he whispered. "I need to see what we're dealing with." Before she could object, he dismounted and moved silently through the undergrowth toward the sounds of conflict. Fiona sat rigidly on Daisy, heart pounding in her chest, one hand protectively covering her belly while the other gripped the reins tightly. Long minutes passed, each second stretching into eternity as she strained to hear what was happening. Finally, Xavier reappeared, his expression grim but no longer alarmed. "Rustlers," he explained, returning to his horse. "They tried to cut out a dozen head from the north pasture. Tom and the boys caught them in the act. One of the rustlers is wounded, but my men are unharmed." "Thank God," Fiona breathed. "What happens now?" "Tom's taking them to the sheriff in Bannack," Xavier said, mounting his horse. "Let's get back to the ranch. This excitement isn't good for you or the baby." As they rode back, keeping to a slow pace for Fiona's comfort, Xavier remained vigilant, his rifle across his lap. The incident served as a stark reminder of the dangers that lurked in the seemingly peaceful territory, dangers that Fiona, as a woman alone, would be particularly vulnerable to. By the time they reached the ranch yard, Tom and the other hands had departed with their prisoners, leaving only Miguel, the youngest ranch hand, to guard the property. Xavier helped Fiona dismount, his hands lingering at her waist to ensure she was steady. "Are you all right?" he asked, studying her face with concern. "That was more excitement than I intended for our outing." Fiona nodded, though her legs felt unsteady beneath her. "I'm fine, just a bit shaken." "Is this common, the rustling?" Xavier sighed, leading the horses toward the barn. "More common than I'd like, especially with beef prices high. Most ranchers around here have lost cattle at some point." He glanced at her. "It's one of the reasons I've been reluctant to encourage you to develop your land. A woman alone would be a target." The implication hung in the air between them. Fiona walked beside him in silence, processing this new reality. The beautiful meadow she had stood in less than an hour ago suddenly seemed more remote, more vulnerable. "I should rest," she said finally as they reached the barn. "It's been quite a morning." Xavier nodded, handing the horse's reins to Miguel. "I'll check on you later if that's all right." "Of course," Fiona replied with a small smile. "Thank you for showing me the land, Xavier. Despite the interruption, it meant a great deal." As she walked toward her cabin, Xavier watched her, the weight of unspoken words heavy on his shoulders. The rustling incident had crystallized something he had been avoiding acknowledging. His feelings for Fiona had moved beyond attraction or friendship to something far deeper and more permanent. The thought of her facing frontier dangers alone, especially with a child, was simply unbearable. That evening, after ensuring the ranch was secure and receiving word that the rustlers were safely in the Bannack jail, Xavier found himself standing once again outside Fiona's cabin. A lamp glowed warmly in the window, and he could see her silhouette moving about inside. He knocked gently, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been since boyhood. Fiona opened the door, surprise evident on her face. She had changed into a simple wrapper, her hair loose around her shoulders. "Xavier, is everything all right?" "Yes, all is well," he assured her quickly. "I wanted to check on you after the excitement earlier. May I come in for a moment?" She stepped back, allowing him entry. The cabin was warm and inviting, with a small fire in the stove warding off the evening chill that came even in summer at this elevation. A half-finished piece of sewing lay on the table, what appeared to be a tiny gown for the coming baby. "Would you like tea?" Fiona offered. "Teresa brought me some chamomile that helps with sleep." Xavier shook his head. "No, thank you, I won't stay long." He took a breath, gathering his courage. "Fiona, there's something I need to say to you." Her expression grew cautious, but she gestured for him to continue. "When I saw those rustlers today, all I could think about was what might have happened if you had been alone on your land when they came through." Xavier paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I know you came west seeking independence, and I admire that tremendously. But the territories are dangerous, especially for someone in your situation." Fiona's chin lifted slightly. "I'm aware of the risks, Xavier. I've never harbored romantic notions about frontier life." "I know that," he said quickly. "That's one of the things I admire most about you, your practical mind and brave heart." He took a step closer to her. "What I'm trying to say, very poorly, is that I don't want you to face those dangers alone. Not because I don't think you capable, but because I've grown to care for you deeply." Fiona's eyes widened, her lips parting slightly in surprise. "I know it's sudden," Xavier continued, words tumbling out now that he had begun. "And perhaps presumptuous, given your circumstances. But I find myself thinking of you constantly, your smile, your quiet strength, the way you've adapted to this place as if you were born to it." "Xavier," Fiona whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Please let me finish before I lose my nerve entirely," he said with a self-deprecating smile. "I'm not asking for any promises now. You're still grieving Benjamin, still preparing for your child's arrival. But I want you to know that if you choose to stay in Montana on your land or elsewhere, I would be honored if you would consider a future that includes me.